and how the literature they made took shape under this shadow. The Cold War may have been a conflict of ideas, but imposing those ideas on the enemy through military means was not an option. As Kenneth Osgood writes in Total Cold War, the existence of nuclear weapons meant that the Cold War, more than any other conflict in human history, was channeled into non-military modes of combat, particularly ideological and symbolic ones. Each side therefore used various forms of propaganda and disinformation as a way to undermine the way its enemy organized its own society. Some of this propaganda was crude and, as such, ineffective. But literature was another matter, for it had a more sophisticated power to persuade. In reading Animal Farm, with its allegory of a revolution gone awry, exploited by corrupt and self-serving leaders interested only in consolidating their own power, Polish citizens might begin to question the received truths of their rulers. That was why it was worth sending batches of the novel through the air into enemy territory. By the time the Cold War began in the late 1940s, the Soviet Union's leaders were already old hands at cultural warfare. In the aftermath of the revolution, they sought to use literature as a means of legitimating their power and as a tool by which to remake society. Part of this project involved educating the populace, and in the 20 years after the revolution, literacy rates in the country rose from below 30% to above 75%. What these new readers should be reading was another matter. While the Bolsheviks argued among themselves about how much autonomy writers should be allowed, they all agreed that literature was political, and that the literature produced in the Soviet Union should light the path to socialism. The number of books published per year tripled by the late 1920s, as editions of the writings of Friedrich Engels, Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, and Joseph Stalin were published in huge numbers. There were also large runs of editions of Russian classics, including works by Anton Chekhov, Nikolai Gogol, Alexander Pushkin, and Ivan Turgenev. To ensure that the new books being published followed the party line, all publishing houses came under the control of the state publisher, Gosistat, to which they had to submit their manuscripts for censorship. Works that espoused bourgeois or reactionary values were banned, and its authors punished, sometimes jailed. Literary production was further consolidated in 1932, when, under Joseph Stalin, all the different writers' groups were disbanded and a new organization, the Union of Soviet Writers, was formed. Its members were mandated to write books that adhered to the tenets of socialist realism. The consequences of deviance became much more serious, with a non-conforming writer facing the gulag or the executioner's bullet. As the poet Osip Mandelstam pointed out, this suppression of literature actually granted it a perverse power. If they're killing people for poetry, that means they honor and esteem it. They fear it, he said. That means poetry is power. Mandelstam, who dared to write a poem mocking Stalin, died in the camps. At the same time as the Kremlin imposed ideological rigor on literature at home, it staged an ambitious and sophisticated propaganda campaign abroad. One of the goals was to win the sympathy of the literary elite of the West, and by implication, the sympathy of their readership. It was not necessary to convert these intellectuals to ardent communists, but to convince them that the Soviet Union was a force for good in the world, against the evils of exploitative capitalism and imperialism. This was partly about self-preservation. The Kremlin knew its enemies in the West wanted the communist project to fail and would seize any opportunity to chip away at its legitimacy. Western intellectuals seemed like ideal targets for persuasion. With the Great Depression appearing to augur the failure of capitalism, communism was, in historian David Priestland's words, a rational system that drew upon the laws of historical development to lead to a kind of secular utopia. Furthermore, Marxism-Leninism cast them as potential heroes in this story, the vanguard who would lead the proletariat into revolution.